Good morning, good afternoon, or good wherever you may be on this beautiful day you're watching. Before we begin, I do want to mention that you are at the right webinar. That is, in fact, me in the photo. That was before facial hair, before COVID. So don't go dropping off just yet. I understand the confusion, but that is me. My name is Johnny Lambor, and I am a senior associate at NFF. Welcome to today's session on managing risk. This is a part 9 of a 12-part webinar series. For those of you who have attended one of these sessions before, welcome back. For those who are new, welcome. I want to acknowledge that no matter what time of day it is, for most of us, talking about finance, let alone nonprofit finance, is complex and daunting at times. We all don't need to become financial experts, but knowing some of the basics can support our mission delivery. The overarching goal of these webinar sessions have been to demystify some of these financial concepts and really bring you all as plus ones to the financial party, where your outfit is nice, the drinks are good, and the DJ is spinning your track. Now, we're all coming into this space with different financial knowledge and experiences, so this presentation is really meant to meet you all where everyone's at. So let's just go ahead and get started. First, I want to acknowledge that we're all joining today virtually from different places, so you want to take a moment to recognize the land we reside on and acknowledge that the land we inhabit today was stolen from Indigenous community. Today, I join you all from Van Nuys, California, the native home of the Tonga people. I invite you to acknowledge the Indigenous territory you are watching from. If you do not know the territory, you can type the link that we are sharing on the screen into your search engine. At NFF, we are on a journey to be an anti-racist organization with a central strategy to increase our partnerships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color led and serving organizations. We are integrating Indigenous land acknowledgements as appropriate into our sessions. At NFF, we are seeking to include voices that were previously excluded. We strive to bravely face the facts of this history, no matter how painful. I hope this acknowledgement continues to build and expand on our understanding of our world. I invite you to learn more about the Native people in each of the respective territories you are watching us today. Before we get into the content, I invite us all to do 3 collective breaths together to move us into today's session. All right. So I understand many of you have been joining our webinars. You've probably watched one of our series before. So I'm just going to briefly share for those who are new, the Nonprofit Finance Fund is also a nonprofit organization and a community development financial institution. We strive to support community-centered organizations led by and serving people of color to gain control of their financial resources and knowledge that they need to make their community's aspirations a reality. We do this through lending to other nonprofits, consulting to nonprofit leaders, and using the insights we gain from the field to advocate for the communities we work with. The goals for today's session is really to develop an awareness of different types of organizational financial risks. It's to build skills to manage risks with an aim towards long-term financial health. And it's also to strengthen ways to communicate your long-term needs to stakeholders. We'll revisit these learning goals at the end to make sure we've covered everything. So in order to talk about long-term financial health, we want to acknowledge that financial health is not the only component of what it takes to achieve, long-term health. It really takes all of these different strengths to be healthy and sustainable for the long haul. So what we see here is really different types of strengths that organizations need to achieve long-term health. You see at the top, you have your relationships and reputation. So these are really our partnerships, our networks, our reputation, and access to community resources. We also have our people and our skills. These are the skills, expertise, experiences of staff, board, and volunteers. These are all of you on the ground doing the hard work. You also have your data and your know-how. How we know what we do works, how we understand our mission impact. This is what we're good at. And then we have the last piece, which is the financial component, the alignment of financial resources to pay for what we do, delivering and supporting the mission in the immediate and long term. Of course, these are all important strengths and not one is better than the other. But of course, we are a nonprofit finance fund. Finance is in our name, and so we're going to be diving into the financial components. So to talk about risk, we first want to define it. So what is risk? Well, you see here on the screen that there's a really broad definition. And we can define risk as the possibility of an event occurring that will have an impact on the achievement of objectives. This is a quote from the Institute of Internal Auditors. Again, as I mentioned, this is a broad definition. And you'll notice that this definition doesn't really define risk or impact of risk as bad or good. It's really just neutral. The outcomes can be good or bad, and you want to manage to both. So there are multiple kinds of risks, and this can be a helpful framework for identifying your own risks. So at the left, we see operating. These are ongoing within business as usual. I was actually just working with an arts organization, and they mentioned the constant fluctuation of ticket demand for their performances. This is an ongoing risk. Again, that's part of their programming, it's part of their business. On the right, you have strategic. So these are planned choices, perhaps new opportunities. That same dance organization deliberately decided to produce another show at this point in time. And that's a risk because there's unknown demand, right? Coming off of COVID, you're not sure if people are going to want to show up. And so that's a strategic decision that was made with an inherent risk. Besides operating and strategic, you also have internal and external. So internal would be existing organizational structure and operations. And these are a little bit easier to control, again, because they're internal. An internal example might be a leadership transition. This is a risk because, again, you might be facing some funder lapses. You might have to communicate this. You're unsure what this leadership transition would bring externally, of course, to funders, but also internally to your own staff and culture. Then you have your external risks. So these are outside decision-making. They could be market forces, disasters. Any of these would be harder to control because they are external. We don't really have a say as to whether they happen or not. Again, examples of these could be a natural disaster, a recession, or maybe a global pandemic. All of these impact our operations and, again, harder to control. So once we put in our baseline thinking, we can now focus on the future risks we face and/or opportunities that we are pursuing. What are some situations that might require longer-term planning? So some questions we can ask are, do we face potential funding loss? Are there certain inherent risks with the programs we're delivering? Are we facing perhaps any leadership or staff turnover? Are you planning on pursuing strategic partnerships? Are you contemplating major growth or maybe even contraction? The real question then is, how do you organize all of this so it's actually useful and not just something that wakes you up at 3 a.m.? As your leadership thinks about those top risks, what we really want to know is, how big is the risk? What might be a flag that triggers us into action? And what is that plan of action should these risks occur? Now, these are risks that we've seen at NFF, but I encourage you to think about the risks or opportunities your organization is facing. Some of these here on the screen might resonate with you, but there also may be some that you're facing that really aren't listed here, and that's okay too. Because what we're going to be covering is how to manage to the risks that you might be facing. And so it's important to keep those in mind. And so I want to acknowledge early on that the operating environment for our sector right now poses a lot of risks. Pace of change feels accelerated, and realities that seemed immutable a few years ago don't seem that way anymore. It's easy to be overwhelmed and paralyzed by how much uncertainty you as a leader are trying to plan for. We're going to shift to talking through getting a handle on this and making a plan before you're in crisis. Because if that crisis ever happens, quick action will determine how well you emerge. So the goal is to focus on the process. When a crisis happens or an opportunity presents itself, you've done the thinking and the consensus building ahead of time, and you already know what to do. You might not be able to erase risk entirely, but you can help control for the risks that your organization is facing. So the question that we see here is, how do we mitigate risk? And we want to change this question from how we mitigate risk to how we manage risk, appreciating that risk is always going to exist, and what's important is the actions we take when it occurs. So how do we start? Where do we even begin? First, acknowledging that mission achievement relies not only on securing financial resources, but on being able to make continuous improvements to program delivery, which really ultimately better serves our communities. Given the complexity and changing landscape, we need to focus both on the now and the future. So what we see here is sustainable. So what we mean by being sustainable is having enough resources to accomplish our mission, now and in the future. So can we make it through this year and the next? And are we meeting the needs we set out to meet? We know that in the nonprofit sector, we're never going to be completely sustainable due to a reliance on third-party donors. And we're never guaranteed to last indefinitely. Really, this isn't even true and guaranteed in the for-profit world, much less in the nonprofit world. There's no perfect business model or secret sauce, but we still want to have enough to be confident that we can deliver on our mission this year and next year. Can we do what we said we'd do? In addition to being sustainable, we also want to be adaptable. So being adaptable means having enough resources to meet changing needs now and in the future. Can we adjust to new conditions if and when we need to? Do we know what to say no to? Are our services still the right services for our community? The reality of nonprofit operation is that it's really a constant game of adaptation. Now, adaptable doesn't mean chasing whatever bright new thing is happening. Adaptable really just means being able to weather change, to continuously ensure our mission and theory of change is the right one, that we're meeting the needs we set out to meet to improve our mission and how we achieve our mission. That sounds daunting, right? Like all good things, building sustainability and adaptability takes time, with some prioritization happening along the way. Let's get into what I mean by that. So building long-term financial health requires a hierarchy of need, and appropriate capitalization can support these different needs. What I mean by capitalization is really just the alignment of the resources we have with our mission and goals. Your resources fall into these three buckets of liquidity, adaptability, and durability, which range from near to long-term needs. So if we start with liquidity, the question is, are you liquid, right? Do you have adequate access to cash to meet operating needs? Do you have enough working capital to manage seasonality or the cyclicality cash flow to deal with the unexpected? After we talk about liquidity, we can then jump to adaptability. So how adaptable are you as an organization? What this means is being adaptable means having flexible funds that allow for adjustments as circumstances change. So it's money that allows your organization to evolve, reposition, collaborate, grow, or even contract as appropriate. Once you've met liquidity, adaptability, then we can now talk about durability. Durability are funds sufficient to address a range of future needs. These are typically revealed by the presence of buildings, endowments, and very long-term savings. An important note is that durability is often equated with sustainability. Many organizations that have achieved the so-called durability lack the cash to manage their fixed assets, so their buildings. What that means is that essentially they are walking wounded. There is a hierarchy of need within every organization. And while many organizations focus on durability, it's liquidity that all organizations need to prioritize first. Let's talk about these three in greater detail. So liquidity. What does liquidity look like? As I mentioned, this is really cash that's easily available to management to pay bills on time, even during periods of negative cash flow. So this is not money that's perhaps in another account. This could be money that's in your bank account, in your checking, in the savings that you have access to throughout the year to manage the ebbs and flows of your cash flow. Perhaps you're waiting on a government contract to reimburse you for the costs that you are going to incur up front. But you know that right now it is May and you need to pay those bills now because those bills are not waiting until that government contract comes in September, right? And so you need to make sure that you have enough cash in the bank to get you through May through September until that inflow of cash comes in to be able to pay the bills, to pay your rent, to pay your people. That is what we mean by liquidity, having enough cash on hand to manage those ebbs and flows of your cash flow. So how do I measure liquidity, right? So this could be your months of cash. You would take your total cash on your balance sheet and divide it by your monthly expenses. This would tell you how many months of cash you would need. Sorry, this would tell you how many months of cash you currently have. Because the next phrase that I'm going to say is, how many months of cash do you need, right? And that's actually specific to your organization. There is no one size fits all approach. But cash flow liquidity should be determined based on cash flow projections. So being able to look at your cash flow, see what those peaks and valleys are of your cash. Perhaps there's 3 months within the year that you realize, you know what, I don't have that much cash coming in. I need to have 3 months of cash just in the bank to be able to weather these 3 months until cash begins to come in later in the year. So as a recap, you measure liquidity through your months of cash. So how many months of cash do you currently have? This is really taking your total cash on your balance sheet and dividing it by your monthly expenses. That will tell you how many months of cash you currently have. And then to determine how many you need as your organization, you use cash flow projections. Now that we've talked about liquidity, we can move on to adaptability. So what does adaptability look like? These are perhaps reserves for risk or opportunity. It could be an operating reserve. Maybe there's a contract or large funder that you're uncertain about and have concerns of lapsing next year. So how much money would you lose and would need to be replaced? So how do you measure adaptability? Well, for this, we measure it through months of available net assets. So we would take our net assets, our total net assets on our balance sheet without restrictions, and we would subtract any property and equipment equity, and then divide it by your monthly expenses. How many months of ANA do I need, available net assets? Again, it depends. The answer is specific to your organization. Resources for adaptability should be determined through a risks and opportunities assessment. Again, thinking through your funders, thinking through your contracts, what's the risk of them lapsing? If they are going to lapse, what are the costs that I need to bear upfront until I find a replacement for that? One of the important pieces is to be able to name why you are holding this cash. How much is needed is mission driven. It's about protecting your community in case something goes wrong. This is also really important. I do want to mention again, the hierarchy of need and the importance of this. We've talked about liquidity and adaptability. I was once working with an organization who they mentioned that they really wanted to focus on building their reserves. And so they began to put money aside. They had a goal of saving $10,000 for their reserves as a start. And what they found really quickly was that the money that they were saving, putting aside into their reserves, wasn't building up. Like they felt like it continued to be depleting, even though they were trying to set it aside. And what they realized was that they were trying to build the reserves without having enough working capital. They hadn't addressed their liquidity. And what that meant was that the money that they were putting aside for their adaptability, for their reserves, was being depleted really quickly. They were having to pull on that because they weren't addressing their liquidity. They didn't have enough throughout the year to manage those ebbs and flows. And that's why the hierarchy of need is so important. If you haven't addressed your working capital and having enough money in the bank to cover your expenses at any point in the year, the money that you'll be setting aside, you're going to have to always pull from if you haven't addressed your liquidity. So make sure that you're following the hierarchy of need. Make sure that you have determined how much a month of cash is appropriate for your organization. And once you've met that liquidity, then begin thinking about your reserves and your adaptability. So we've talked about liquidity, we've talked about adaptability. The last piece on the hierarchy is durability. So what does durability look like? These could be fixed assets like facilities and equipment, perhaps maybe very long-term pledges or endowments. Now, tips, we don't really suggest endowments for nonprofits, but a tip is perhaps having an investment reserve for durability purposes, but with the structure that allows for liquidity and adaptability if needed. Endowments are permanently restricted funds that you'll never be able to touch, and it's really never necessary, or usually never necessary for nonprofit organizations, unless you're very large institutions like schools and universities, which are a different thing. So if you are thinking about perhaps an endowment, we would suggest having an investment reserve for durability purposes that you're able to pull the returns on your investments, but also with the flexibility that if you ever do need to pull that money, you are able to do so and support your liquidity and adaptability if needed. So having that flexibility as nonprofits, as you all know, is extremely important. So how much durability do I need? The answer is specific to your organization. You probably guessed that. It really depends on mission delivery strategy, and some of you may need very little durability. For most nonprofits, liquidity and adaptability are sufficient, and we're struggling to even get that. Missions that are needed in the same way, in the same place for a long time need more durability. You can think about hospitals and schools. Others are better served by keeping their resources adaptable. So those doing advocacy, community organizing, on-the-ground programming that need to constantly be able to have those resources to pull from and not tied up in fixed assets or in durability. So now that we've spoken about what we're trying to focus on and how we can plan for risk, we're going to talk about ways in which we can build and communicate this. But before we get there, I'm offering this here as a chart that might help you, one, just benchmark where you're at now, but also where you need to focus on. Again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is what we've seen in the sector. And these might change depending on your organizational needs. What we see here are 4 columns. The red column on the left, which means you need to take action now. The following column is the vulnerable to shocks, then making it work, and then handles risk. So let's give a few examples here. Perhaps we have less than a month of cash and less than a month available net assets. So again, our liquidity and our adaptability. Perhaps our business model is producing sizable deficits. This means we might be in the need to take action now column, which means we probably need to focus on our liquidity. It might be that we're struggling to have enough cash on hand to pay our bills on time. And so again, focusing on liquidity before we think about building on your reserves might be important for this column. If we move to another example of perhaps the green column, which is making it work, perhaps maybe your organization is producing small surpluses. You're producing surpluses year over year. You're able to build up some of those surpluses and invest them into your months of cash, into your months of available net assets. And so perhaps here, you've amassed anywhere between 2 to 5 months of cash on hand, and you've amassed anywhere between 2 to 5 months of available net assets. Maybe you need to focus on one or the other. Maybe you have a larger goal for months of net assets and a lesser goal of months of cash. Either way, this is a good place to focus both on liquidity and adaptability. Again, the important piece is knowing what is suitable for your organization. For organizations that really depend on government contracts that get reimbursed, perhaps maybe 3-6 months after the expenses have been incurred, perhaps maybe for you all, 6 months of cash might be necessary, right? It might not be something that is your best goal. It might be something that's actually needed. For other organizations that don't rely on government contracts, perhaps maybe it's individual donors, maybe it's foundations that don't take a long time to receive the cash coming in. Perhaps maybe 3 months for you is necessary. Again, depending on the cash flow that you are seeing for your organization is going to really determine what you should focus on and how many months of cash should be your goal, as well as how many months of available net assets. So we talked about liquidity, adaptability, and durability. How do we communicate this and how do we build these? So what we see here is a graphic that really generally, it's how we think about what happens on the finance side and what we know is helpful in building up financial health. But we know that the reality right now is that surpluses may not be realistic. That might be fine if you have the cash or other resources available to support it. What we see here on the screen on the left, it starts with our business model. So it's really what we see on our income statement, our revenue, our expenses, and our bottom line. What we hope to see is that this business model is producing consistent surpluses to build our capital structure, really the resources found on our balance sheet. Through these consistent surpluses, we're hoping to build that capital structure, again, our liquidity, adaptability, and durability, and appreciating that it takes money to adapt your business model and to build the resources dedicated to serving your mission in the short and long term. Now, that healthy capital structure is built from two sources. The first is through surpluses, which we're seeing here. A strong business model that throws off surpluses sufficient to invest back into the organization is a really good business model. Of course, often showing surpluses gets pushback, right? How many of you have maybe been approached by a board member, maybe a funder saying, you know what, surpluses, nonprofits aren't meant to have surpluses, or we're demanding a bottom line of zero. So how do we communicate the need for a surplus? Well, one of the ways is through communicating it through a bottom line and really a below the line. And so again, some funders or board members demand a zero bottom line. And so the first step is to explain why. Why do you need a surplus? So budgeting to break even will not cover all of the organization's costs, and it really undermines ability to deliver on mission in the long run. We've seen what those costs are outside of our income statement, outside of our budget, that really need to be covered, right? Our working capital, our reserves, costs that we don't see on our budget or income statement, but that are still pivotal to mission success and long-term health. The second step is to show it into your reports. So indicate plans for the use of surpluses through below the line. And I'm going to show what that means in a little bit. But this is to demonstrate good management and satisfy the request for a balanced budget. So what do we mean by below the line? So on this slide, you can see the addition of the amounts on the notes or assumptions here. We have our regular budget. We start off with our revenue at the top. We have our expenses at the bottom. And then we have our operating surplus and deficit. What we see at the bottom is the additional section of the priority balance sheet needs. So what we see here is that within our budget, we are including those needs that we have determined as an organization. So we see for this example, we see working capital budgeted for $50,000. Perhaps you also determine that you need some fixed assets, right? You need some laptops. Perhaps you've hired new individuals, or in this remote work, you've realized the laptops you've always had are no longer sufficient. And so you're also going to need $5,000 for new laptops. So what we see here in this example is that before your balance sheet needs, this organization was producing a $37,000 operating surplus, right? Which is normally what we would see. But by adding these priority balance sheet needs, by adding your working capital, by adding your fixed asset additions, we realized that those balance sheet needs are an additional $55,000 expenses that the organization will incur. And now you went from having a $37,000 surplus to now being short $17,500 because of these additional balance sheet needs. This is really an important goal setting tool. It will not only help you think about how to raise additional dollars to fund these expenditures, but it can also help facilitate a conversation with your board about how to achieve some of your long-term goals. When nonprofits budget for all of their costs and communicate their full capital needs to funders, they put themselves in a better position to avoid crisis and provide uninterrupted services for their communities. Covering all of our costs as both a nonprofit budgeting practice and a philanthropic strategy will allow leadership to stay focused on mission and outcomes. So we see here again below the line, this is that communicating that surplus, what the surplus is going to be used for. So it's not about just saying we need a $37,000 surplus, but really stating why through this below the line. As a recap, and this is a tool to set goals internally to really determine what are our balance sheet needs and how much is appropriate for them. Being specific, again, this is for working capital, this is for fixed assets, perhaps this is to start my reserve or my operating reserve. Being specific and calling out why you need that surplus. And then of course, this allows us to ask the question, how would this impact the organization's ability to meet its mission, right? What happens if we don't have this working capital? What happens if we don't have these new laptops? And of course, you can always adapt communications to the audience. Perhaps a funder is requiring this level of detail, or it's helpful to communicate to a funder why you need this surplus. But perhaps maybe the conversation shifts when you're talking to a funder, or perhaps maybe when, I'm sorry, not a funder, with a board member, or perhaps when you're talking to an individual donor. Perhaps maybe this presentation is not the most useful, but the goal and strategy is the same, being able to communicate your balance sheet needs and those needs outside of our regular budget and income statement. So we spoke about the first method to build liquidity, adaptability, and durability, but there's a second method as well. So the second way to build a healthy capital structure is through capital infusions. So these are external infusions of capital that can be invested in business adaptation or enterprise needs. Some capitalization priorities tend to be more readily addressed with a one-time capital raise versus surpluses. These funds are expected to be spent down for their designated purpose and not replenished necessarily on an annual basis. So perhaps these capitalization needs may be major building improvements or relocation, recovery funds, maybe perhaps to pay back any debt, or a program or opportunity reserve, funds to be spent for revenue generating capacity or programmatic pilots. Some of these are examples of what might best be served through one-time large investments and not through ongoing surpluses. The reality is that building long-term financial health through surpluses is often looked at as the local train on the left. Often surpluses are modest year to year, so supporting liquidity, adaptability, and durability through surpluses may take time. Right? The expectation is not that you're going to have a surplus of $50,000 in 1 year, and you're going to be able to allocate all of that to your working capital or allocate all of that to your reserves. Building surpluses year over year is a process, it's a journey, and it takes time. You also have the express side. So this is different, right? This is building long-term financial health through periodic capital infusions. So there's those large one-time gifts. And these can fund liquidity, adaptability, and durability investments quickly. So if you get a huge infusion of cash, maybe perhaps a funder gives you, again, $50,000 to support the relocation or renovation of a building, or perhaps $50,000 to put into a reserve, a really express and quick way to build your liquidity, adaptability, and durability needs. This is not to say that one is better or worse. We're just noting the difference, and perhaps you may need both, right? What's important is the journey. So what are some main takeaways? Well, the big one is budget to a surplus. We can't stress this enough. But of course, as I mentioned, financial health is a journey, not a destination. So adopt the practice of budgeting to a surplus. I know it's always hard because of the inequities in the system that have ingrained in us to show and to demonstrate that nonprofits don't need a surplus. But really, this is a myth. Nonprofits do need a surplus. And so make sure we are getting into the practice of budgeting to that surplus. And of course, make progress on your goals over time. Again, the expectation is not that you're going to fulfill all of your needs in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years, but being able to set your goals in terms of how much working capital you want, in terms of how many reserves, how much of money in your reserves you need, is going to be really important to set those goals and then track your progress over time. Perhaps maybe in 1 year, you're setting aside $1,000. Perhaps maybe the next year you're able to produce a surplus and you're able to set aside $5,000. Again, being able to track your progress on your goals over time is going to be really important. The next takeaway is to remember the hierarchy of need. Of course, liquidity comes first, right? Your working capital. Do we have enough cash on hand to pay our bills on time, to pay our people? And of course, determine the metrics that are right for your organization. Just because one organization may need 6 months of cash doesn't mean your organization will also need that amount. Figure out what is most appropriate for your organization depending on your cash flow, depending on your seasonality, and make that your goal. And of course, the last piece is like help the sector do better, right? Talk with other funders and nonprofits about the importance of surpluses. Again, this is a myth that is known within our sector that nonprofits need to do less with more, that we don't need surpluses, that we don't need working capital or reserves. And so being able to talk with funders and nonprofits about the importance of surpluses is crucial. I will acknowledge that NFF is also having conversations with funders about supporting surpluses, and we're on this journey for that and to advocate for surpluses. And of course, lastly, again, it's open the conversation with your grantors and grantees. So this is specifically for funders. If you are granting money, again, NFF is also having these conversations, but if you're a grantee, talk with your funder again about the need for a surplus. Use that below the line budgeting, right? Show the importance and what these surpluses will do for your organization. It might mean that having working capital for your organization, having enough access to cash would mean that it frees up management and leadership to not focus and worry about paying the bills on time, but focus more on mission success and mission delivery. Focus on those strategic questions and not having to figure out, do I have enough cash in the bank to pay my people? So our learning goals for this session was to develop an understanding of different types of organizational financial risks. We went over operating, we went over internal versus external, strategic, different types of risks. The second goal was to begin to build skills to manage risks with an aim towards long-term financial health. So how do we think about liquidity, adaptability, and durability for our organization? How do we think about how much we need? What's appropriate? And then lastly was to understand ways to communicate your long-term needs to stakeholders, right? So now that we know what our needs are, how do we communicate this? It's through below the line, it's through advocating for surpluses, to being explicit about your needs. So the next session, if you are tracking the series in order, will be understanding full costs, one of NFF's core concepts and a great framework for advocacy and equity. So as you see here up next, this session will be given by my wonderful colleague, Ashley Franks. As it's noted on the screen, full cost refers to the true cost of doing business for nonprofits, including total expenses, working capital, and reserves. In this webinar, NFF will walk you through the full cost of operating your organization and communicating that cost to funders. Ashley will define the components of full cost, provide language that names and claims nonprofits' full cost needs, offer guidance for prioritizing your organization's hidden costs, and share tips for discussing full costs with key stakeholders. I hope you're able to tune in for this session. I do appreciate you taking the time to watch this webinar today. I hope it was helpful and hope you will join our next session on full cost. Thank you very much.